in the gospel community spectrum, we're not going to hit ignorance. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, it's the first of the 4 stages: ignorance, awareness, intentionality, and gospel community. And ignorance would be that stage where, I don't want to make it sound like it's racist people there, because it's not. Usually people in this stage are, I mean, they're not racist. They would love for everybody to get along, but they're unaware that there are issues of race that really need to be talked about and dealt with in order to be able to move to gospel community. Yeah. Good-hearted people who are just like, I'm not a racist, so why don't we all get along? When, there's a couple different areas that this shows up in, and we talked about one of them last session: indifference to the struggles and the difference of perceptions. We talked about how growing up as a person of color in the United States is still a different experience than growing up. With all the progress we've made, there's still difference, and you told some stories about your experience with that, and being willing to listen, to learn, to understand why you perceive a problem that maybe somebody like me in the majority culture doesn't perceive, because we sit on the other side of it. And it's undeniable that regardless of what the answer to all of it is, it's undeniable that people of color and those of us in the white majority see that differently, right? Yeah. So that's indifference. And then the other phrase, part of it is an unwillingness to adapt. So being part of the majority culture in a church that is filled with a majority culture, then we have certain styles and ways of doing things, and we don't even recognize that everybody may not do it that way, because that's the way we do it, and that's our world. Right. Ways of that we lead. Of course, obviously, styles of music and just different cultural mores that we just learn to take for granted. And I mentioned this in the last session. Most majority culture people say they would love to be a part of a multicultural church, but what they really want is to be a part of a multicolored church, right, where everybody comes in and of different colors acts like they're all a part of our culture.
Yeah, and I think that's important to recognize, because as we looked at in Acts chapter 10, this is the very thing that Peter, in Judaism, and him being a Jew of Jew and all that, that was the idea. You assimilate to the Jewish culture. You got circumcised, you got all the things that to become a Jew, and to some degree you had to denounce your race. But as we see,
or at least leave it at the door.
Yeah, at least leave it at the door. But now you see like the progression in Acts, basically what you see taking place in Acts chapter 10 is that you no longer have to be a Jew to be a God follower, to be a Christ follower. And Peter, like God had to put Peter in a trance in order to kind of get that through to him. Right. But the idea of ignorance, like as a minority, it kind of hits me a little bit wrong. Right. Because when I think about this word ignorance, it's kind of like, I don't have the privilege to be ignorant. I am born in a majority culture. I am born in a place where my minorityness, if that's a word, minorityness.
It is now.
My minorityness forces me to recognize that I am a minority. So kind of tying it with Peter, is it ignorance? I mean, how do you frame it, and how does minorities in your church? I mean, have you ever discussed that?
Well, I see it on 2 major fronts. Okay. One is, most of us in the majority culture haven't realized how pervasive and deep racism was in the story of the United States. Yeah. I mean, obviously, from the very beginning, there was slavery, even when things are reversed. I mean, the Jim Crow laws, some of the just unjust economic practices that have shaped present realities. Right. I mean, I read about one the other day, 1944, the GI Bill. Was a bill sponsored by our government that gave mortgages there were 67,000 mortgages that were given on the GI Bill. Less than 100 went to people of color, which meant that white people had the ability to move out of the cities into the suburbs, and it kind of continues on to this day, but many of our brothers and sisters of color didn't have that option, and that's led to the creation of some of the ghettos and that type of thing. Yeah. Well, I mean, regardless of how we want to address that's a past injustice that has affected current and present realities, right? Yeah. Yeah. And in addition to that, there was a stereotype that undergirded a lot of the myths that went around why slavery was okay. Right. It was like, well, this race is inferior, and those stereotypes, we can conquer them with our minds in one sense, but there can still be a perception. I've got an African American friend who says, sometimes when I walk into a room, I feel like I have to prove that I'm smart, I'm articulate, I got to prove that I'm responsible. He says it's a burden that I carry that you just may not be aware because you've just sort of taken it.
Yeah, I call it the inferiority complex. And really what it is a lot of times when you feel like you are inferior to someone, or you've been taught that you've been inferior
for a couple hundred years.
Yeah, for a couple hundred years, you've been taught that you're less than human. You don't deserve this. You drink over here, I'll drink over here, whatever it may be. So a lot of times you take on these kind of self-fulfilling prophecies that either, okay, you call me inferior and you think I'm gonna act this way, then I'm gonna take it on and I'm gonna act that way, or I'm going to have to prove to you that I'm more than that. But a lot of times what I try to teach our church is that James chapter 1 talks about, to those who are privileged, you need to think more lowly of themselves. To those who are lowly, you need to think more highly of yourselves, because we are all peers at the foot of the cross. Is that we got to recognize it, and until we recognize that tension, we need to understand. And I think that's an important thing for us to understand, especially as churches, because a lot of times we think about we got to diversify our churches, so we got to diversify our staff. And if we diversify our staff, what we need to do is like, hey, let's bring on the black people or the Hispanic people to reach the Hispanics or to reach the black. Like we're feeding into that thing, because what we're saying to some degree as a minority pastor, is that I'm good enough to reach my people, but I can't reach our pastor, the majority culture. And it says something to me. And so now I got to go and prove something. And I think that is that thing that we got to address.
Yeah, and you kind of alluded to it. What was more evil? Was it the actual laws that enslaved a race, or was it the assumptions about humanity that undergirded those laws?
Yeah.
And we can change the laws, but it has effect on the black race, it has effect on the white race, and there are things that we still just at least need to acknowledge and be working through and be in a state of repentance and praying for each other. Another thing that I think is crucial to this conversation is understanding what justice is in the Bible. Because most of us grew up with an understanding that justice was righting a wrong that somebody else did, pulling down the oppressor. Yeah. But throughout the Old Testament especially, books like the book of Amos, justice in God's sight is equated with lifting up the oppressed. Yeah. We usually think of lifting up the oppressed as charity. And if you don't do it, you're stingy. God says actually it's unjust. Anytime the word justice, mishpat, in the Old Testament is used, it's almost always connected to the vulnerable, the foreigner, the widow, those kinds of things. And God is saying to Israel, if you're going to be a just people, then you're going to leverage your positions of strength and privilege. You're going to use that to help other people enjoy those same benefits. Yeah. I've heard somebody say that privilege, George Yancey, he's a member of a Baptist church in Texas, and a Southern Baptist church in Texas, and just a very brilliant thinker on this. He said privileges are like rights. Yeah. You don't want to take rights from one person and give them to somebody else. You want to see the rights that one enjoys, you want to see everybody enjoy them. He said, biblically, we want to see the privilege that certain people enjoy in society. We want to see those become the blessing for all people. And those who have experienced privilege, whether it's racial privilege or whether it's financial privilege, and all of us, experience privilege on some level, that we want to leverage that to help extend that to others, and use our positions to be able to lift people up.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. We talk about the idea of justice and righteousness being that same word, and about having right relationship with God, right relationship with one another. I think that's a critical thing, because I think that's a great distinction that you talk about. This is not charity, this is about justice.
It's the heart of God.
It's the heart of God. And so when we miss the heart of God, it is what the Bible calls missing the mark, which they call sin. You're not treating me in the same way that God has made me.
Yeah, and a lot of us in the white community, I think we hear this discussion and we think, well, I wasn't even around 50 years ago, when all this was going down. But in another sense, I am born into a society where the sins of the past have shaped the current realities and have launched out stereotypes that continue on in the present. And it has also given me some, some privilege, whether that's, cultural characteristics, whether it's access to money and social networks. And I don't have to feel guilty about having, enjoying those privileges, but it does mean that I should be working so that others who don't have the same access, that they would be able to get them too. And so white guilt is different. That probably is inappropriate, but to be just and righteous means that I'm going to use this position so that you can enjoy the same blessings and freedoms in the church and in society that I enjoy.
Yeah, a lot of times I talk about it's taking initiative for the benefit of others, right? This is a part of that God took initiative. He didn't scream from the heavens and say, get saved, get it right. No,
Right.
Jesus came from heaven to earth too.
Yeah.
You know that.
Well, you should go with that.
But like he came from heaven to earth. And I think that is a critical thing, is this him being the ultimate privilege, like God came down to reach us, and so that we can have so that we can have a relationship. And I think it's critical because we see all throughout the scriptures that this idea of baptizing all nations, right? Go in Acts chapter 1 and 8, it says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the world." But we see in Acts chapter 6, going before Acts chapter 10, that they was like, no. I prefer us just building this thing, over 50,000 Jews worshiping the Lord and loving it. But God had to bring persecution to get him out. And then it was in Acts chapter 10 that he started having to interact with the Judea and Samaria of the world in the uttermost parts. And if you recognize, it wasn't until Acts, in Acts chapter 10, they had to start dealing with kind of doctrinal issues, because they had to just how Jewish does a person have to be in order to be Christian? And I think that's the conversation that we're constantly having to ask.
Which brings up one thing I think is critical in this session, and we talk about it, is the willingness to adapt and the discomfort. Yeah. I would imagine, and I've heard some of our members of color say this, that, man, when they come into a white majority church, they're just aware from the beginning they're going to have to adapt to something as simple as worship style, to length of service, to how we do things. That if we're serious about it, it means that we're going to have to be committed to be uncomfortable sometimes as well. A willingness, a comfort with being uncomfortable. Yeah. One of my friends, Vance Pittman, Vance out in Las Vegas, he says the sign that you're in a multicultural church is that sometimes you feel uncomfortable. Yeah. He said if you feel comfortable all the time, he says you're not in a multicultural church, at best you're in a multicolored one. And we've got to be willing to say, okay, we've got gospel things we don't compromise on, obviously, nobody's saying that, but we are wanting this to have realize that it's not white culture that should necessarily define the local church experience. And
I love what you're talking about with that idea of uncomfortability. A lot of times when people in privilege, they ask, the majority culture asks that question, well, how do we really engage? How do we do it? How do we understand, even going back to the inferiority complex? A lot of times I tell them, have you ever took a mission trip to a foreign country? I was like, do you remember all the insecurities that you had when you were speaking the language, and the kids were laughing at how you said hello, how am I, like those insecurities, will they accept me? Will they like those insecurities? Just imagine that, but also imagine that you're not going anywhere. You're there.
Right. That's where you live.
That's where you live. And that's the idea and the mindset that oftentimes minorities who are in a culture that they are perpetually the minority and have to kind of become bilingual in order to win, if that's a thing. And I think that that's a critical piece.
Right.
That we have to acknowledge when we're in this ignorance phase. And I think that's what Peter, in there, when he went from going in and God had to put him in a trance to, and seeing that God was working among the Gentiles in the same way that he was working among the Jews. And I think that was critical when he had to go from having to be converted to when the next set of Jews came in, and they was just like, what's up with these Gentiles? And he was like, hold up. Remember the stuff that happened to us in Acts chapter 2? That happened to them, and I'm a witness. And I think that's really critical. And so I'm really excited as we kind of move to awareness and begin to address that in the next phase.
Yeah, which is going to be built on relationships, and that's what we're getting to, because those are the critical piece, the relationships, to be able to move us there. So that'll be a good session.
Amen.